So we're proud to present Joe Allen for the third time. It's a record for us. At today's episode of Urban Green Live, What's Next for Healthy Buildings? I'm Ellen Honigstock, Senior Director of Education at Urban Green Council. Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. We invite you to be mindful of these during the program, both while you're listening in and asking questions. And now I'd like to turn it over to our CEO, John Mandyke.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you, Ellen. I'm looking forward to our discussion today. As Ellen mentioned, I'm John Mandyke. I'm the CEO of Urban Green and host for this program. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a carbon neutral future, and you get to participate too, because we're going to have live Q&A in just a bit. Before I start, I want to thank Carrier for sponsoring our program today. Carrier has been providing longstanding support to Urban Green and the Green Building Movement and Urban Green Live, so we appreciate the support for the program today. Now, as Ellen mentioned, today we're going to explore what's next for healthy buildings with one of the world's foremost experts. So I'll bring Joe on. Joe, if you turn on your camera, that'd be great. My guest is Dr. Joe Allen. Hi, Joe. Joe is the assistant professor at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health and director of Harvard's Healthy Buildings program. And as Ellen mentioned, it's his third time on Urban Green Live. It's a record for us. Joe's been a constant in the world's media, helping to better understand the role of indoor air quality during the pandemic. And he has just a new book he released. Actually, he helped debut it at our gala last month, called Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Make You Sick or Keep You Well. So Joe, welcome back to Urban Green Live.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I didn't realize it was the third time. I just feel like we have these discussions every now and then when there's something interesting to talk about. So
that's
good
right.
To be back.
So for our repeat viewers, you'll remember that the debut, the very first Urban Green Live was in March of 2020. And Joe is our very first guest, so we appreciate that. And Joe did the interview from his car, which was unique. But Joe, I'm glad to see you graduated from the car to your home office.
Yeah, wild times, March 2020. Yep, like everybody else, just trying to figure it out, make sense of the science, and just get by. I forgot that was from the car.
Yeah, that was great. So let's start there, Joe. You know, it's hard to believe that we're almost numb to this pandemic at this point. So maybe you can help us start with the big picture. Is the pandemic under control, or are we just in some holding pattern until we scramble for the next variant?
Wow, what a question. Yeah, I mean, look, I think you can see it, the way people are reacting now and going about some of the things. We're back to sports, restaurants, movies, travel. You see a lot less masking on the subway, everything else. I was back in New York last month. The streets felt alive. It felt like New York again, not pandemic New York. And I think that's in large part to a couple things, right? The vaccine, the boosters, and just a whole lot of infections since Omicron about a year ago, right? So what that's led to is this real buildup of population immunity. Everyone's in some level now. No one's immune system is totally naive anymore, right? Maybe 95% of the country has seen this virus, hopefully through the vaccine and booster first, or through community infection and any combination of that. And I think what we're in right now, and you start to see it, not quite, we don't like to use the word endemic or endemicity, but you start to see that we have these, that the threat is decreasing for people who are vaccinated who've seen this, the threat of severe disease. Still lots circulating. And we really have, we're moving from those of us in the susceptible population. Maybe you got vaccinated 8 months ago, maybe some immunity has waned. And then you get infected, you move into the group that's had a recent infection or recent boost. And we keep just like exchanging this population. The virus is circulating widely and it's leading to this hovering. If you look at the wastewater data in New York or Boston, that's what it looks like now. We have these ups and downs, but we haven't had these gigantic surges. We're going to get a little bump, or a bump for sure, this winter, but the overall effect on the severe disease of the population is diminishing. And in fact, what's interesting, John, we talked in March 2020, those early models all showed this peak, valley, and eventually it starts to taper off and lead to some kind of steady state. And this is where we're starting to be.
So what are the big lessons so far 3 years in?
Whoa. Well, let's start with buildings. I mean, let's start there, right? I know we talked about this in March 2020. I wrote about it in January 2020. Buildings should have been the first line of defense. We missed this for a year. And it's just so obvious, right? You start with how are you exposed? And if you say it's droplet and foamite or surfaces, yeah, you clean ketchup bottles and you stand 6 feet, you put stickers on the floor of your office building. If you say it's airborne, well, then my building matters. It's ventilation filtration. Hopefully everyone's bored of that by now hearing that, right? I'm tired of hearing myself say it. But for that first year, we know it wasn't the case. It was ignored. And so that shift has now fully happened, right? And just this year, the Biden administration put buildings on par with vaccines and therapeutics and testing. And now first time ever in the pandemic plan, buildings. So we've turned that corner. That is a massive shift and change, and one that's not going to go away. And we finally won that argument, and that was good. I mean, other big lessons, I think public health, we moved really slow on some things. I think we did a great job on getting a vaccine out quickly, but we were really slow on the testing, right? It took us 1.5 years or 2 years to get those rapid tests. Everyone could test really cheap. They should be way cheaper than they are. We should have had them in the first couple months. The tech was there. We could have been producing these things for $1 a piece. You could swab, in 15 minutes, the answer, instead of these $100 PCR tests. That was a big mistake. And finally, the regulatory hurdles have been quashed. Now you can find these things everywhere. You're going to see a rapid test for influenza and everything else. So some big gains there, but that's a massive lesson. And I think also on the data side, I think we've seen that our CDC wasn't built for this rapid response, massive data influx and rapid decision-making. Our response was slow, it was stagnant. This had to be a rapid response. So we knew what we needed to do. We had a lot of the tools, a lot of the regulatory hurdles kind of kept us back. People ignored airborne in buildings. And we started to finally get a handle on that. Vaccines came through, boosters came through. We started to focus on buildings, rapid tests. And you start to see it changes things. Oh, I can go to school now. If I don't feel like I can take a rapid test, do I have COVID or not? And those things really, really helped, of course. And you start to see the kind of the renormalization or, shift into the people getting back into society and less of the lockdown mode.
So do you think we'll see rapid tests for other infectious diseases going forward?
Absolutely. I think, pandemics, right? Everything changes when these things, remote work, now we Zoom all the time, right? It was happening, but now it's everybody everywhere. Same thing on the medical side, right? Now you can do these kind of rapid tests at home. There are tests now, a 3-way test, RSV, think about what's hitting right now, RSV, influenza, and COVID. So you have the sniffles, you test, what do I have? You can tell the doc, call her up, what do I have? Okay, it's RSV, here's how we're going to treat you. It's COVID, here's how we're going to treat you. And think about what's happening on the flip side of that, which is the treat from home, right? So even in New York City, over the past year, maybe longer, you could test with a rapid test, 15 minutes, find out you have COVID, order Paxlovid, the therapeutic, and they deliver it to your door, right? You don't go to the doctor's office. You don't wait, 3 days for a test result. You don't got to go to the pharmacy, pick it up. It's like I tested, I placed the order, someone drops it off, I'm getting treated. Really amazing. Like these are like landmark shifts and how we operate and organize on the public health and healthcare side.
So, in New York, just in the last few months, we've seen 3 public health emergencies declared, right? So we had COVID, right, which we knew. We had monkeypox, and now polio, a health declaration, emergency declaration for polio. So I guess my question is, has the world always faced multiple viral threats like this, or is there something new going on?
Wow. It's a little bit of both, I think. I mean, think about, let's take the things that have always been there, right? We've had infectious diseases. We have departments of infectious disease at School of Public Health. I think it's what kept people in public health up at night a lot. We narrowly missed a couple pandemics just in the past 20 years. SARS-1, MERS, other influenza. So that's always been around. I think a couple things are changing. The polio one is, quite frankly, really scary. And I think that's been building for a long time, right? We had a lot of success thanks to vaccines, and it was out of people's minds for decades. And you could have gotten by not being vaccinated because there was so much herd immunity. So many other people were immune. You start getting a lot of people and especially when it gets clustered in communities who are having the same thought. Well, I don't need it. Everyone else is vaccinated. Soon you have a whole group of people who are unvaccinated with a really transmissible disease, a virus. It causes really severe disease. And it's just like simmering there, and we had it under control, and we have the potential to really lose control there. So some of that's really real. I think some of the vaccine, anti-vaccine, a lot of this butting of heads over the past and polarization over the past since the pandemic hit on the vaccine is really going to hurt us. I think with childhood vaccines, I think that's a long-term problem. On the monkeypox thing, I mean, that's real. It's all real. I think some of it got extended because I think what you have that's different, John, is you have a hyper-aware public and a hyper-aware and activated social media and media system around infectious diseases. No one was talking about coronaviruses. No one was talking about influenza. No one was talking about monkeypox. Now you have disease hunters, disease experts. The first sign of anything, people share. When monkeypox hit, even though it was mostly impacting one community, people were talking about closing schools. Hey, once this hits schools in September, it's going to be a big problem, even though the demographics of transmission did not tell that story at all. But the ecosystem is just ready to roll. Red alert, this is new, flashing red lights, and you have a public that's been consuming it rightly for 2 years, right? Really tense. So any new infectious disease thing is now front page news, whereas before I think it was in the public health community. Yeah, we were dealing with monkeypox, we were dealing with polio, we're dealing with measles outbreaks still. Same kind of idea, but it just hadn't hit, consumed everybody. Look, we dealt with influenza every year. It causes massive amounts of death and disruption, but it's not something that you were probably thinking about more than if I got it, I'm sick for, a week or 2 weeks, not, how does this impact my business continuity? You're not reading on the front page of the news every day. I think so. I think a lot's happening there. It's all interwoven.
So let's switch and talk about buildings. You had mentioned it before. So what surprised you the most during the pandemic? So we talked about, we went from stickers on the floor to mechanical systems and ventilation, but are there behaviors that have surprised you? Are there new technologies related to buildings that have surprised you?
Yeah, I guess two things surprised me, and one's in a really good way. That I guess I thought that when COVID hit and it was a crisis, every building shut down, right? That we get a better handle on it, to be honest. And then people would eventually return to work, whenever that was, return to the office, return to whatever, with controls in place. And then I suspected that people would kind of start to forget about it, right? Hey, we made these improvements and we're done. I've seen the opposite, where people started paying attention to their buildings, and then it was everybody paying attention to the buildings. And then it was so far beyond COVID. The conversation right now, it hit the C-suite, and the C-suite started paying attention to their buildings in a really different way. And the conversations now aren't even about COVID. Ventilation, filtration, biophilic design, acoustics. Well, I had a meeting with a senior executive at a really big company recently. What else can we do? They're so into this now, and it is so beyond COVID. That's been a really pleasant surprise that it didn't drop off and say, okay, we're done with our buildings. That's been really great. I think on the negative side, I think there's been, I've been frustrated, particularly around schools, and that, we had the money, we had the know-how, we knew what to do, and we couldn't get it done in a lot of places. And that's, I think, because I work in the private sector, okay, let's just get it done. And there's a million reasons that makes it really challenging in places like schools and in other organizations too. But that's very frustrating to me, particularly as a public health person. Hey, we have this virus. We know exactly what to do to keep people safe. The money's there. We just got to do it. And it doesn't happen. And that's, surprising, maybe not surprising, but more frustrating. We could have saved a lot more lives, reduced a lot of sickness, got kids back in school, got small businesses back open. And some of that happened, but not enough. So
let's continue in that vein. So for people who are designing and building new buildings, let's start there with new buildings. What's the advice you give them when it comes to indoor air quality? What do they need to think about?
Yeah, I actually don't think it's all that complicated. I'm keeping it really basic. You and I have been talking about this for a really long time, John. Bring in a little more outdoor air, clean that air a bit better with some good filtration. Pay attention to what you're putting in your building so you don't create, high emitting sources indoors. It really gets back to the fundamentals of my field. Control some of the sources, do a bit better job with dilution, good filtration. It's the absolute basics. And then I think you can start to have these conversations about, are there new technologies? Is there something else you want to deploy? I really like the movement towards real-time indoor air quality monitors. We can talk about that more later if somebody has a question about it. But I think that's some of the new tech I'm getting excited about in terms of, hey, this is what you can do. And then also you want to monitor it. So that the thing you have to do, number one, is don't just design to code. The code minimums are just not health-based, right? They're just not. And we have plenty of science that says, well, here's how you can do it better. So that's at a minimum. And then you can talk about what specific things we have to do to start hitting these higher targets. Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, are there better design codes or better design guidelines out there?
I think there are. Yeah, I mean, we're doing this with companies across every sector of the economy: entertainment, finance, biotech, pharma, commercial real estate, nonprofits, homeless shelters, like with the federal government. So the science is really there. There's new certifications on the market here. We have local jurisdictions putting out guidance. So it's not a mystery on how to create a healthier space. And I think if you're not designing a new building towards these higher standards, you run the risk of having a property or a building that's just not that's not going to meet the future demand or expectations. Right? Look at the White House talking about clean air in buildings. CDC, NIOSH are all, and nonprofit organizations are all standard setting bodies are working on these better standards. We're not going lower than where we are now. You design a building to this low standard, New York City, federal, ASHRAE starts setting these higher standards, you're going to have a stranded asset, really. And especially when the science is so clear and the industry is just moving so fast towards going beyond these minimums.
So then how about retrofits? Is there a different strategy?
Well, honestly, it's simply not the case that it's the new buildings the only thing we can do. I've been doing this for 20 years, fixing buildings that have had a problem. It doesn't take much, right? So you can't overhaul everything, but a couple of tweaks to the system. I like the idea of real-time indoor air quality monitoring there, upgrade filtration, same thing. Next time you do a fit out, make some better decisions around your windows and the healthy material selection. Start doing all these things and you can really take any old building you think is outdated, right? Not designed to healthy standards, and turn it into a healthy building. So yeah, there's clearly things you can do from the existing building standpoint. And I also think there's a nice interplay, or has to be an interplay with owners, developers, and the tenants. So we worked with some big clients where we're producing the design guide for the building and design guide for tenants. So they start to marry up, and now you really have a holistic, healthy building that you're working on and working in.
So pre-pandemic, if there was ever such a time, I have a hard time remembering it, but pre-pandemic, the health movement and the healthy buildings movement and the sustainability movement and the sustainable buildings movement were coming closer together, but still separate in many regards. How do you see it now?
Well, how do I see it? Or I think they've been siloed. I think there's an effort right now, and actually it's the moment right now. All right, so I think the green building movement, COVID hit, a lot of people put sustainability, green building, energy efficiency on the side, says, you know what, we just got to go all out here, keep people from dying in our buildings, slow this is a crisis. So you had a big pendulum swing this way, and now it's coming back. Climate crisis didn't go anywhere while we're dealing with the COVID crisis. You see all the funding that's coming in to play. You see great things that you're working on with your team, Local Law 97, everywhere else. And so you have this massive collision happening, a good collision that has to happen, because fundamentally you can't have a green building that makes people sick. That's unacceptable. And you can't have a place with good indoor air quality. You can't have a healthy building that makes people sick because of the way we're using energy and causing outdoor pollution. So it's unacceptable to have both. And what we're seeing, I think, is that the really good companies, really good designers, architects, organizations are finding ways that you can actually have both. We can actually have both. It's a total myth you can't. And I think whereas, maybe you had a group over here doing healthy building, group over here doing sustainable buildings, green buildings, they hadn't been talking, but I think they're clearly talking now. Yeah.
Great. So you've got your new book behind you there. I see it.
That's right.
Great yellow cover. Thanks for sharing it at our gala with all our folks.
Yeah, it was fun.
What did you unexpectedly learn writing the new version of this book? Like, do you see things differently now? Just kind of after writing and researching for this edition of this book?
Yeah, well, you're an author, so maybe I'll start on that side. What surprises you writing a book? So on the author side and personal stuff, anyone's thinking about writing a book, it's a lot of work. You don't do it for the money. It's a labor of love. I wrote every single day for, I think, 9 months. And I loved it. I loved every bit of it, but it's work. It's a lot. And I think the other lesson on writing, and I'll get into other things that are surprising, but on writing, that it forced me to think through some of the things I'd been doing and think about their longevity. In other words, like what ideas are here to stay? Because it takes about 2 years from the time you think of it, write it, publish it. It takes a long time. And so you can't write about something that happens in the moment. Hey, did you see what happened? I'm going to write. That's a blog. That's an op-ed. And so that forces you to think differently, like what's going to sustain through this? What surprised me, I didn't know our book would come out in April 2020 and be in the middle of a pandemic. That's, of course, was a surprise. I also think a surprise was the really having to weave the ideas, writing with a co-author, John Macomber at the Harvard Business School. And they always say, you don't know your topic until you teach it, right? And I've been teaching it, but I've been teaching it to public health. And so to talk about it with a business school professor with a totally different lens, who has totally different terminology, forced me to sharpen mine. And honestly, it forced him to sharpen his too. And we had a great editor who didn't let any BS slip by. Right? That doesn't make sense. You're hand waving there, and so we end up with, I think, is a really good product. It's I think really readable intentionally. It's not written in public health jargon. It's not written in business jargon. There's enough of it. It's grounded in good business, good science fundamentals, but it's the merging, I think, that was that made it really work. I don't think it would have worked if John wrote it or I wrote it. I think it had to be, I think we had to collide our disciplines a bit for it to work.
So when it comes to public health and buildings, how do you see things differently now, having done the book?
So weird to say, not all that different. I mean, I think I've been pretty forceful for a long time that my bias is really clear. The way we design, operate, maintain our buildings determines our health. And been yelling it for a long time. And I think it's just been rewarding that, I think it's accepted. I think, unfortunately, it took a pandemic, but people have woken up to the reality of our buildings. You had a novel virus that spreads entirely indoors, collide against a building stock that's been designed not to health. And what do we think was going to happen, right? And so everyone's really wide-eyed now about this problem that we've been talking about. I've been talking about with you, traveling over the world with you, talking about this. So I think, it didn't change all that much, other than I think it's now, out of the niche little field, my indoor air quality field, a couple dozen scientists around the world working on these problems. It's mainstreamed.
So for the audience, I have a couple more questions for Joe, then we're going to move to audience Q&A. I see it's coming in, so that's great, and you can upvote questions. So Joe, here's a big question. What's the role of government when it comes to indoor air quality?
Well, I think there's a big role to play, and either from the government, or I'll even put it on like non-governmental bodies like ASHRAE, the standard setting bodies that ultimately get into code. Because I mentioned this in my remarks at the White House a couple of weeks ago. I don't think, look, I think right now the way it's going is the way it always goes. I think in the beginning, companies with money, schools that are well resourced or financed, putting in these improvements, right? And I think the real danger of the healthy buildings moment right now, like it's a critical point, is that it could just be that people with resources are going to have healthier buildings. And that's totally gross and totally unacceptable, right? And I think the way it's going to have to, that not to be the case, is it's going to have to get into code. Why are we designing schools to bare minimums? Why are we designing offices to these minimums? So if we set that and it just becomes the new norm, are these higher standards, then we can start to influence buildings in affordable housing and schools. And it just, that's the way it's done. That's the way it's done. I want to be put out of business. We always use healthy materials. We always use better air quality. We always use better filters. Great. So I think it's on groups like ASHRAE. I think the White House is trying to push these levers too, NIOSH, CDC, to set these higher standards so we can have some guidance out there and force this into practice, not just for people who think it's a good business, idea, trying to protect their asset. All that's great and fine, but that means a lot of people are going to be left behind if we're not careful.
So do you think those organizations that you just listed and others are game to do it?
Wow. Well, I'll be blunt. I've been blunt. ASHRAE is the standard setting body for ventilation. 2 years into the pandemic, they've set a lot of the guidance. We have higher ventilation filters. They have not set a target. Why? Why? I don't understand it. I mean, I understand the complexity of consensus bodies and all this, but it's a moment, right? And I think they're in danger of becoming irrelevant on that topic, much like, you think about a lot of our codes on energy efficiency. Soon we just blow past some of these organizations. Cities start taking the lead. I think there's a role for my organization, or one I'm a part of, the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'm a certified industrial hygienist. The president there's taking good leadership to say, well, we can set these new standards for workplace health and safety. I think that's a great idea. I think CDC should set a standard. I think NIOSH should set a standard. And right now, you have bits and pieces, but I at this point in the pandemic, John, it's really interesting. I think there's a handful of us, maybe, that have put out specific guidance on a target. Think about that. March 2020, what we say, more air. What's the next question? Well, how much? So we have a target in my book. We put out a target for schools, published a target in JAMA. I think there are 3, maybe 4 articles with really defensible targets. How is that? 2 years into this pandemic, it's obviously a point of frustration for me, but you see what's holding us back. So who does it? Well, the building that can do it, or someone who's paying attention to Twitter, or the articles coming out in JAMA. Yeah, I fixed my building, I increased ventilation rates. What about the school that's not paying attention? Facility manager is too busy to do this. Well, until it says, here's the target everyone has to hit. Great, now I have a target, the money's there, here's the technology and the approaches, let's get it done.
So if our audience wants to go find your targets, where should they look?
A couple different places. So in the book, we talked about one of the chapters on the 9 foundations of a healthy building, puts out ventilation target and other targets for good strategies around healthy buildings. Published an article in JAMA, American Medical Association, talking about air changes per hour, targeting 4 to 6 air changes per hour in rooms with typical ceiling heights. So those are 2 good ones to start with. Yeah. Great.
Okay. One more question for you, Joe, then we'll go to the audience questions. So let's teleport you to 2030.
Okay. Please.
I'm going to go with you. So we're standing in 2030. We're having a glass of wine and looking back, what will the decade of the 2020s be known when it comes for healthy buildings?
I think it's going to be healthy buildings as where we start to see the great convergence around health healthy buildings as we think about it now, indoor air spaces, green building, smart building, safe building, all merging under, I think, this kind of buildings that are designed for health within the 4 walls and beyond the 4 walls, that protect us indoors, do right by the environment in terms of our energy choices, low embodied carbon materials, healthy materials for our interior furnishings, right? No fossil fuels. This is like the dream, and we have to get there. So, I think, well, maybe the climate, I think everyone's still in a little bit of silos, even the safe building people, smart building people, right? They're all starting to talk now. So 10 years from now, I think it's the same, it's one thing, and we have to solve these problems, right? Like, I don't think we have time to say in 2030 we're having this same conversation. I'd love to see it. I think we have to get there, both on the climate side and the healthy building side. And I think we're poised to do it, right? We know what to do. You know what to do. These new laws are being put in place. All the kinks are being worked out. A lot of the technologies there. There'll be new tech too. There's real serious investment dollars or federal dollars coming in for stimulus. There's private investment. So I'm optimistic that we'll be having a glass of wine. Maybe we'll be out of business. There's no more need for a urban green council or a healthy buildings movement. It's all just how we do it.
All right. Let's go to the audience questions, and I'll remind the audience you can vote up questions that you like. First one here is from Jeffrey. It says, I heard remarks about the buildings being a prescription to address viruses. What kind of capital is required dollar per square foot to deploy needed technologies beyond pre-COVID design standards, and who pays for it?
Well, it's a good question. And so I think depends on what we're talking about. And I don't always think it needs like crazy new technology. I'll point you to a report, my Lancet COVID-19. So I'm on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. I chair the Lancet's task force on safe work, safe schools, and safe travel. We put out a report this summer First 4 healthy building strategies every building should pursue, right? Simple stuff. We can link to the report. Maybe we can have it as a resource at Urban Green. And it's this: number 1, commission your building or give your building a tune-up, right? So first thing, the design standards are here, they're too low. Buildings slip over time. Just bring them back up, improves indoor air quality and saves energy, saves you money. So it's hitting your climate goals. Number 1. 2, increase the amount of outdoor air. Just maximize what you can do with your existing systems. 3, upgrade to MERV 13 filters. I'm sure I said this in March 2020. MERV 8 filters protect equipment. MERV 13 filters protect people. That's a no-brainer. Low pressure drop, not going to cost you a lot. There's low pressure drop MERV 13 filters. So really simple stuff. The costs there are not that great when you factor in the health benefits as well. First, commissioning is going to save you money. It actually saves money. I think Lawrence Berkeley National Labs says the ROI is on the order of 3 to 5 years. So it's a money-saving approach. Fourth thing is we talk about is the use of the portable air cleaners and things like this, which gets down to a couple dollars per square foot. You can do a room for a couple $100 device. Portable air cleaner with a HEPA filter is going to get you to that 4 or 5 or 6 air changes per hour. In the event you can't do anything to your infrastructure, you're having trouble bringing more outdoor air, you should be able to handle a MERV 13, but let's say you can't. And then you can move to the more advanced technologies. Maybe we'll talk about some of those, but I think it's actually about the basics. And I tasked my task force with that this summer. Everything's getting overly complicated. This new tech, that new tech. What are the basics everybody should do right off the bat that doesn't cost a lot of money and actually might save money? We think it's those 4 strategies.
Well, just to follow on to that, I know you work with a lot of building owners and developers. Have you seen any that are actually starting to build either health or productivity paybacks into those investments?
Sure. So proud to say for a couple of years been working on flagship building right in Midtown Manhattan, JP Morgan's new headquarters. Right, talking years ago, John, when we were doing the work on the COG effect study, showing links between indoor air quality and better cognitive function, worker productivity. It's caught the attention of executives, and that building really, all electric, renewable energy, and double the ventilation rates, double the minimum ventilation rates, high filtration, indoor air quality monitoring. Right, talk about the merging of these, green and healthy. So right there in New York City, you have examples, and others are doing it too. Where you can actually achieve this. We can have healthy indoor spaces and actually have an energy efficient building.
Great. Okay, next question from John. Where have things leveled off regarding air ionization technology for HVAC systems? Does this have a decent impact on IAQ or is it somewhat negligible?
Yeah, this is a highly contentious topic. There are lawsuits flying around every which way. I'll tell you, the way I kind of look at new technology for buildings, I kind of ask 3 questions. 1, does it work? Simple enough. 2, does it produce any unintended consequences or byproducts? And 3, what problem is it solving? Like, what's it replacing? So the first one is we think about bipolar ionization. There's been a lot of laboratory testing, shows it can be effective in a laboratory. There's been some published or not published, but reports of in real world settings. I think the efficacy depends on a lot of things. I don't think it's quite clear to me what the ionization target should be and why. And so that's number 1. 2, some of these technologies have the potential to produce ozone, and they can create ultrafine particles, and they can convert some VOCs, complex volatile organic compounds, into less complex volatile organic compounds. All 3 of those things, ozone, ultrafines, and things like formaldehyde, are respiratory hazards. So you have the potential, depending on how it's run and what the system is, to create secondary byproducts. Third, what's it replacing? Can you increase the amount of outdoor air? Can you improve the filtration? Can you use these portable air cleaners with HEPA filters, which are, there's decades of science behind them that they work. So what are you using it for that you can't solve with some of these tried and true methods? I'm not anti-technology, I'm pro-technology. I just think for me, I have to weigh all the technology against those kind of criteria, which is really straightforward. And I'll be clear, since the beginning of the pandemic, you look at my recommendations, first piece I wrote, February 9th, 2020, it's all the same: ventilation, filtration, portable air cleaners. I think it's notable for what I have in my list as just as notable what has not made my list.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question from Sarah. Whenever I go to an event, their COVID policies never say anything about improved fresh air or filtration. Is it just me? Or is it going to take a while for retrofits? Are those retrofits happening? So it's a good question, right? I mean, like, if there are COVID policies, do you have a vaccine? You know, are you wearing a mask or not?
Yeah.
Nobody's talking about the building. You and I've talked about, are you interviewing your building? You know, what are questions people should ask? And have you seen buildings marketing themselves for the good work they're doing around filtration?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's super frustrating, right? Like, well, how do you know? And it's really hard to tell. And yeah, and John came up with that years ago. I threw it in the book. You know, are you interviewing your building? And what would you actually have to ask, right? Good air quality is invisible. You can't really tell if it's well ventilated or well filtered. Maybe you feel it's stuffy if it's really underventilated, but you know, largely you can't really tell. So it's a couple things. So first, I think companies should be doing it. And now that the public is highly aware, why not? I think there's some certifications out there. There's some indoor air quality companies that'll put something up and say, hey, I tested the air quality, it looks pretty good. There's a real move towards these real-time indoor air quality monitors. I think you'll start to see displays. In some countries, it's required to be displayed. The indoor air quality level of carbon dioxide, which is a proxy for ventilation. I have 2 sensors behind me, one on my desk. I think that's something people can do. If you can afford a couple $100s, you can get one of these lower cost CO2 monitors, and you can kind of go in and quickly get a sense of your space. My office is underventilated. I should pop up
I
my
saw
window.
that number there, Joe. That's not too good.
Gotta hide it. No one's in here with me, so it's not a transmission risk.
Better
If I had
open the window.
COVID, but if I'm a little slow, my cognitive function's bad. There's your answer.
You better open the window, buddy.
Well, my neighbor was blowing leaves, so I can't. So anyway, I'll probably get worse and worse as the next 20 minutes goes on. But yeah, so we can't see it, we can't interview, but we should ask. People should be promoting this if you're doing it. Well, it's a great story to tell. Oh, and here's something really interesting for your listeners that I think is helpful. The White House had its first ever summit on indoor air quality a couple of weeks ago. They now have a clean air in buildings pledge. So this is great. Really simple, 4 things to do. 1, have an indoor air quality plan. 2, maximize ventilation. 3, good filtration. 4, communicate it. Engage with your community. If you do all of that and make the pledge, the White House will actually give you a stamp or a sticker. Put it on your website, put it on your event site. If you're committed to doing those things, you can actually promote it, and you're meeting the White House's Clean Air in Buildings Challenge. So really cool. That's brand new. I think it's only 2 or 3 weeks old.
Great. Okay, next question here. This is a good question. It gets back to your roots, Joe. We don't talk that much about mold anymore. How much of a health problem does mold pose in buildings?
Yeah, I think COVID has so dominated. But it's funny, I wrote a blog post with a colleague of mine, and there's a new public health magazine at a Harvard School of Public Health. And we had a post out today on mold, actually. So I think those of us who do this kind of work think about, the classics: mold, radon, asbestos, PCBs, right? Like the things that have never really gone away, or constant issues in buildings. I think it's a big threat in buildings, in the sense that it's a constant. Can be a constant problem, right? If you're not managing your moisture right, or you have a water leak, but also it's something very controllable, right? We know what to do with it. So I agree. I think the COVID has pushed so many public health topics off to the side, but I'm starting to see some of them come back, which is actually nice. I think hopefully we should be talking about more of these kind of, the basic or the hazards we've known about in indoor air quality issues, forever, really, but we've been sidelined in the conversation.
Maybe just to follow up on that question, like what are the telltale signs of the sick building, right? So that was a terminology maybe 20 years ago. You don't hear much of it anymore. So are buildings not sick anymore, or are they, and they're just not being diagnosed?
Yeah, I think what happened was we had a global sick building event. We had a 2-year global sick building event, and really all spread was indoors, John, nearly all of it. We have very little evidence of outdoor transmission. So we'll have to change the terminology on sick buildings, because we've all experienced it, in a devastating manner. But yeah, so how do you know what a sick building is? Having done these, where people have issues, see if it's something severe, cancer cluster, buildings where people had died, or you see mold. The best way to tell if it's a sick building is talk to the people. Honestly, people know their buildings. Hey, it's not quite right. At 4 o'clock, there's a smell over there. There's something wrong over here. I have a headache every day at 5 o'clock. Like, often people are quickly dismissed as complainers. I've done hundreds of these investigations, right? They're nearly always dismissed. But the best scientific instruments, us, and they know their buildings. So I think that's the first step. People saying, hey, they feel tired, the temperature's off. I mean, every time you hear that it's a temperature complaint, number one complaint in buildings, you should be thinking that's a health issue, that's a business issue, that's dollars running out the door. That's someone not doing their work because they're so distracted. They can't concentrate, they don't feel comfortable. They're talking to the person next to them. Hey, this is not I don't feel right. This goes on days and weeks. You're losing, profits just slipping out the door. It's a business issue. You correct that, people are focused, and actually we know improved temperature, improved air quality actually can concentrate better. Like it's quantitative at this point. So anyway, short answer is I trust the people and pay attention to what you think are minor complaints. There's actually health complaints that if you take care of, improves health, but also is good for the business.
Okay, next question with 6 votes. So what's your advice for low pre-watt? Let me start over. I need more air quality in my office too, Joe. What is your advice for low-rise pre-war multifamily buildings in New York City without many resources?
It's a really good question. I'm going to take the absolute basics here. I think you should look for lead-based paint. I think you should look for asbestos. I think you should look for PCBs, legacy pollutants that are going to be in older buildings pre-1980. I'd look for those first and foremost. Second, I'd think about integrated pest management. So control things like my mouse and cockroach and rat allergen. So these are things that we know influence quality of life, but also influence our respiratory health. I think those are some of the basics. So you increase the pest management, the cleaning, and then I think in terms of air quality, if there are things you can't manage through the building, right? In these buildings, you're not going to put something new, and we have old buildings at Harvard too that we can't, there's no mechanical ventilation. I think you can start to solve this with lower cost portable devices. So if you're worried about respiratory aerosols or air pollutants or particles from the road, a good portable air cleaner, you can get them relatively inexpensively, and they work really well. You can also build your own portable air cleaner. I think it's, not cheap, but it's 60 or 70 bucks. So not a couple $100 like a commercial one, but, under $100. If you have a kid who has asthma and there's not much you can do in your building, you could build one of these little devices. There's guidance all over the web on it, and they work pretty well. So there's even some really low cost do-it-yourself kind of tricks out there. But I pay attention to those kind of the big ones, the legacy hazards. They're not legacy, unfortunately, but I mean legacy in terms of they've been banned or phased out, but they still exist in a lot of old buildings like lead and asbestos and PCBs.
Okay, next question is about electrification. So it says, with building electrification adoption on the rise, in what ways do you foresee mass heat pump installation affecting indoor air quality?
Really good question. I mean, first, I'm a big supporter. I think this is just taking off, and has to take off. Is that a question? I'm not sure if the question is there some big negative we're expecting? I'm not expecting.
No, my guess is it's a positive. So if you're in an apartment that has steam heat, and you put in heat pump, replace it with a heat pump, what does that do for the air quality? Are you getting more air turnover in the space? I mean, is it improving it from that perspective because you have a different ventilation filtration system?
Okay, sorry. So there's maybe some. Yeah, I was having a hard time thinking what the negative would be. No, that's positive, of course, on the climate side and energy side, and getting off fossil fuels. I think anytime if you're introducing higher ventilation rates, better filtered air, it's conditioned better thermal comfort. I think there are a lot of benefits to be had on top of just the electrification, getting off fossil fuels. So I don't see any draw. There just should be no reason why we're not deploying these everywhere. Really, is my view. Yeah.
Next question: should ERVs balanced with supply exhaust be code minimum for multifamily?
Makes a lot of sense to me. In terms of again, the merging of climate and health, right? You spend all this money and energy to condition air. Why aren't we capturing that on the flip side as we're exhausting it? So that makes total sense to me. Yeah, we should be using energy recovery ventilation, heat recovery ventilation. These are no brainers. I think if we think about the whole system, right? So we're electrifying the grid. Now, what can we do in the buildings? Not electrify the grid, green the grid, electrify our buildings, getting off fossil fuel. How do we start to save energy? Because that's absolutely key, because the answer had been, well, I'm going to tamp down ventilation rates, right, to save energy. But here, there are actually technologies out there. You can do a really good job of keeping air quality good while not, tossing out all that expended energy. So I think it has to be part of the package of solutions. I'd pair that with the smart building side too, where we're just getting use demand control ventilation, getting a lot smarter about where and when we're dumping air in, instead of dumping air in the building all the time when people aren't in a room, and then conditioning that air and then trying to recapture that. Why dump it in the first place if the space isn't being used?
Okay, here's a follow-on question from Sarah. Sarah, thanks for all your good questions. It says, there doesn't seem to be a consensus on how much CO2 parts per million is too much. What do you recommend for multifamily?
Yeah, I agree. There's not a consensus, and I'll bring up mine. It's getting worse and worse the more I talk. 1,500 parts per million. So, yeah, there's not consensus, but forever the rule of thumb has been 1,000 parts per million. Under 1,000 parts per million, you're good. Over 1,000 parts per million, you're not good. But that's based on the design standards, which are not health-based. I've been using 800 parts per million as a good cutoff. Depends also what we're trying to think about. Overall ventilation, or you think about COVID risk in particular. And I mentioned COVID for this reason. And by the way, I'm going to give you a great tool to help you set a target. But think about COVID risk. If you have good low CO2, I think under 800 parts per million, I think you're in good shape. If you have high CO2, it doesn't mean it's risky per se, because filters don't capture CO2. You might have ventilation that's too low, but you might have an excellent filtration gain. Right? So high CO2, you still want good ventilation, but if you have 1,200 parts per million, it doesn't necessarily mean it's an unsafe space. You might have great filtration going. But let me get to the tool that hopefully your listeners find really helpful. We just released it on the Harvard Healthy Buildings website last month. It lets you set a target for any space. So you say, I want 6 air changes per hour. You enter the dimensions of the room, really simple. Length, width, ceiling height, number of people in the room. Is it 2 people? Is it 20 people in a classroom? Whatever it is, that's it. You hit calculate. It's going to tell you the CO2 concentration. And that becomes your target. So you could say, get really specific. I want 6 air changes because maybe you like my paper that says we should target 4 to 6. Okay, I want 6 air changes. I have 20 kids in a classroom. Dimensions are X. Hit calculate. It's going to tell you, do not exceed 900 parts per million or 930, whatever the number is. So it's a really cool tool. We hope it's helpful, but that you can set a really tailored CO2 target for each space and activity level. If you're running around a lot, in a gym, you're generating a lot of CO2, it's going to be a different target. So we let you actually play with that. Is it a room full of kids reading a book, or is it a room full of adults, in yoga class or something?
Thank you. Here's a good question from Sarah. Really good question. Do you think ASHRAE is concerned that if they set a specific target for ventilation, they fear they'll be held liable if people get sick? Or is it just the complexities of the buildings and the occupants?
Yeah, I don't know the answer, what they're thinking, but I'll tell you the liability thing is real. I think that's what's made people very cautious about putting out a number. I don't know if that's why ASHRAE hasn't put out a number. I actually don't know why. They actually had an ASHRAE epidemic task force. I know people who served on it. They had a number. They never saw the light of day. I don't know why. Could be liability. I'm not sure why. It was a really great group of scientists, but people should ask that question of them. I really don't know the answer. But the liability one is real. I think it's held back a lot of people in my field from putting out a number. But we had a 100-year crisis, and people needed guidance. You can't just tell a school bring in more outdoor air in office. Like, the question is how much. So I feel very comfortable doing it. I feel really comfortable with what's in the book. It's fully cited, defensible. I feel 100% confident in the numbers we put out. And actually, what's interesting, this is interesting. If you look at the research that's come out since COVID, we put out a number early in the pandemic. It's all coalescing between 20 and 30 CFM per person to decrease COVID risk. We put out 30 CFM per person at the start of the pandemic, day one. And so I feel proud about that. And reassured that, as new papers have come out, it's all hovering around right where we called it from the beginning.
Okay, next question. I'm not sure either of us will have an answer for, but it's a good question, is how do we improve code compliance in addition to having stricter codes?
Great question. That's going to be out of my wheelhouse for sure. I do think there's something on the, with the availability of these kind of monitors. It's no longer the case like compliance is, you got to hire an industrial hygienist, bring in some $10,000 piece of scientific equipment, pretty quickly you can get a sense of whether the space is meeting that code. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how you enforce that at scale. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess that's where my head went is, are tenants sufficiently educated on this to start asking questions of buildings and owners and developers if they have all these portable devices? We have one too. It's just sitting right outside my office. I think it's the exact same one that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that that it's policed or self-enforced. But awareness is really high. I guess I think some of that would have to would play into this. And then I think on the enforcement side, kind of like anything on the enforcement side around buildings, there's enforcement through liability in the courts too, where people aren't doing what they say they're doing or should be doing. There's that kind of last check. I think, I don't know, it's not the great last check, but I think without a standard or target, none of that happens. You could say, hey, Joe, I maximize ventilation. You might do, I don't know, 20 CI per person. Your next door neighbor might do 40, like, because there's no target out there. Yeah.
Here's a follow-up on ionization. It says, regarding ionization, to date, ASHRAE only recommends UV technologies for virus and bacterial abatement. Have you seen anything that might have changed ASHRAE's policy?
No.
All right. Sufficient and easy answer. Next question. How do higher ceilings change air turnover needs and indoor air quality?
Well, I think that's a good one. I think, well, we had to simplify a lot of the messaging when the pandemic hit, right? Simplify air changes per hour, kind of give this general guidance. But of course, each building is different. There's a lot of nuance, ceiling heights, airflows, the type of, we're doing some computational fluid dynamic modeling, basically airflow modeling indoors. And we're seeing that, of course it matters where the diffuser is. Is it diffusing from the floor? Is it over in the corner? What are the flow rates? Where is it located? Ceiling height. So all these things are going to matter with the mixing, but you do get a benefit with the higher volume room, right? You have if you have people in the room, right? We get these thermal plumes. The air is mixing. You have a larger dilution volume. So I do think we're overestimating transmission risk in these higher volume places because you get that dilution effect. You can still have a buildup in these places if you have really poor ventilation or poor filtration, but you do get the benefit of the added volume and dilution space.
Okay, last audience question here so far is, how concerned should we be about defective plumbing and the possibility of disease transmission through pipes?
Very. I think right now in particular, so I've done a lot of work, actually opened up the book with the story of my work doing investigations of Legionnaire's disease, which is a waterborne bacteria. This bacteria grows in stagnant water in pipes, in the biofilm in pipes and in dead legs in buildings. And I've done this work in hospitals where people had died from Legionnaire's disease, kills thousands of people every year. You've had major outbreaks related to cooling towers in New York City, high profile outbreaks. So it's something we should think about for sure. And to me, it's also one of these things that's super controllable. Like we know the problem, we know how to control it with temperature, disinfectant, controlling pH. I talk about all this in the book on a section on water quality. And so it's really controllable. And the reason it's still a big issue right now is you have buildings that are at really low occupancy. So what happens in some of these buildings? Well, you're not getting water flowing through the pipes. You're not getting the fresh disinfectant. Stagnant water temperature starts to hit in that sweet spot for bacterial growth. And so next thing you know, somebody comes in, if you have a building with a shower or water features, no low flow, you could have these massive buildup of bacteria very quickly. So you have to flush your system. I recommend testing the chlorine levels or the residual disinfectant, checking the pH levels because the effectiveness of chlorine is pH dependent. Check the water temperature, some really simple stuff, all controllable. But I think a lot of people, particularly right now with these under-occupied buildings, I think the threat of Legionnaire's disease in particular and Legionella is much higher than it's been in the past.
Okay, we'll take our last audience question here. We're running at the top of our hour. Is there a cool tool where we can see CFD visualized?
I'll give you a great one. So we worked with the New York Times and we worked with JB&B, great engineering firm in New York. And on a visual, it was about maybe January 21, right? Still trying to get people to understand airborne transmission is dominant. And it's a great CFD model that the New York Times put in one of their really great stories with the visuals. And you can actually see the tracers of people's respiratory aerosols coming out of their mouth through the room, see how it builds up in a room and how it blows past the 6-foot buffer, starts to accumulate, and everyone in the room is exposed. I thought that was one of the most effective media pieces that started to move the needle on airborne transmission in buildings. Because, right, we talked about it earlier, you can't see this stuff. Once you see the CFD model, you see these tracers, it's like, oh, this is obvious that this thing is going to spread beyond this little sticker on the floor that tells me where to stand. And if we're not doing ventilation filtration. So I love that that New York Times. I use it in presentations all the time still. It's a great visual.
Great. Well, we're already at the top of the hour here. So Joe, I really want to thank you for such an informative discussion, as it always is. Thank you for spending time with Urban Green. We always appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, John. Great to be back for a third time, and congrats to you all on your 20th anniversary.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to thank again Carrier, who is our sponsor for today's program. We support the sponsorship of this particular episode and everything that Carrier does to help make our work possible here at Urban Green. We have a few great upcoming programs for you to think about. We have another edition of Urban Green Live on, I'm sorry, let's start with our holiday member reception on December 6th. It's always a great event. So if you're in New York City, please stop by. It's also where we kick off the election for our board of directors for next year. We'd love to see you there. Look on our website to sign up for that. And then another edition of Urban Green Live on December 13th with Laura Popa, who is the new Deputy Commissioner of Sustainability, to talk about the new New York City Bureau of Sustainability. And it's a great way to continue the conversation we started at last week's record attending webinar on Local Law 97. So check us out for that. So Joe, thanks again to everybody. Thanks for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you at another Urban Green event. Have a great afternoon.